In a secluded valley just north of the Appalachian Spine, St. Gabriel Monastery stood cloaked in silence, its limestone walls absorbing the passage of time like prayer. Locals recall it as a place of discipline and devotion, where the bells tolled with unerring precision and the ground seemed untouched by modern unrest. Yet by the mid-1970s, a cold disquiet gripped the region. 23 priests once active within the monastery's cloistered corridors were gone. No memorials, no graves, just absences noted quietly in quarterly registries. The official line remained vague. Transferred. Returned to Europe. Withdrew from orders, but families never heard from them again, and over 18 years not one body was recovered. Founded in 1891 by an order with roots in Bavarian asceticism, St. Gabriel Monastery was known for its strict theological conservatism and regimented daily life. Located near the former mining town of Calton's Bridge, the monastery became a vocational hub for men seeking spiritual rigor over ecclesial publicity. The monks rarely left the grounds. The order did not solicit donations, nor did it open its doors to the public. The self-sustaining enclave ran on an agricultural calendar, with Gregorian chant echoing through stone chapels and hand-bound volumes preserved in a private scriptorium. In the Catholic directories of the time, St. Gabriel was referred to only by its monastic code, OPR 119. Yet records from the diocese were inconsistent. Letters sent to the families of missing priests carried no parish seal. Clerical assignments listed in the archival office vanished from subsequent annuals. And in 1975, one whistleblower from the diocese filed an unsigned letter to a Philadelphia journalist with a simple typed line, "They never left the valley." The early perception of St. Gabriel Monastery was shaped more by what was withheld than what was shared. To the public, it was barely more than a distant architectural silhouette, hidden between a lattice of pines and cold river tributaries. Its physical seclusion had a theological foundation. The founding order, Congregatio Servorum Angelorum, emphasized obedience, silence, and penance. Novices surrendered personal possessions upon entry. Letters were screened before being sent or received. Days began at 4 a.m. with the recitation of psalms in Latin, followed by manual labor, scriptural study, and fasting. The outer community, largely composed of German-descended farmers and retirees, had no reason to question its integrity. To many, its detachment was a form of devotion. For the Diocese of Calton, however, St. Gabriel posed both a logistical advantage and a bureaucratic irritation. On one hand, it provided a consistent source of ordained men for rural parishes in 3 counties. On the other, its refusal to adopt post-Vatican II reforms made it a thorn in the side of modernization efforts. Records show that diocesan officials often received unsigned reports of infractions, refusals to offer Mass in English, unauthorized penances, and concerning extended seclusions. These reports were filed away, occasionally marked addressed, but with no clear follow-up. By 1961, there were already anomalies in the internal personnel logs. Clergy who were listed as residents of the monastery were later removed with the annotation "released from service," without any forwarding assignment. In several cases, letters addressed to these individuals were returned undelivered. When families attempted to visit, they were told the priest had moved on or was on mission. One woman from Lancaster, whose brother had entered St. Gabriel in 1953, reported being turned away at the gates in 1965 with no explanation. She never saw him again. The institutional facade was maintained with near-military discipline. Public correspondence from the abbot, Dom Vincentus Meyer, emphasized prayer, tradition, and the importance of resisting worldly influence. Photos were rare. Tours were not permitted. When occasional seminarians from other orders visited, they were monitored closely and lodged off-site. One such seminarian, in a 1983 deposition obtained years later, recalled that he was told by a senior cleric, "What happens within these walls is not for your discernment." By the late 1960s, internal transfers slowed. Rather than priests rotating out to other dioceses, the monastery became a destination for those in need of reassignment, a phrase used ambiguously in clerical circles. Some had records of ideological conflict, Others had ambiguous disciplinary notations, but once at St. Gabriel, many were never heard from again. The towns surrounding the monastery began to notice subtle changes. Supply trucks that used to deliver flour, salt, and paper in predictable intervals now arrived irregularly. The gravel road leading to the monastery, once modestly maintained by local contractors, began to show signs of disrepair. A former delivery man interviewed in 1979 recalled that during his final visit, a different group of monks came to the gate. He described them as unfamiliar, silent, and reluctant to meet his eyes. When a local journalist submitted a request to visit the monastery in 1970, citing growing public interest in the monastic way of life, she received a one-sentence reply: "Our purpose is contemplation, not exhibition." Her article never ran. Editors feared retaliation from the powerful archdiocese. In private correspondence, a diocesan archivist wrote that no monastery should function without external accountability for more than a generation. He was later reassigned to a seminary in Arizona. The veil of authority that protected St. Gabriel rested not only on the obedience of its members, but also on the institutional inertia of the wider church bureaucracy. Diocesan offices were overburdened. Investigative capacity was minimal. A monastery with a reputation for silence and doctrinal purity became an unlikely sanctuary for avoidance. There were no public accusations, no scandals, only absences that accumulated slowly. In March 1972, a retired bishop from Ohio named Emmerich Tallon attempted to conduct an informal audit of religious communities in the region. His visit to St. Gabriel was blocked. He was told that outside evaluations were incompatible with the monastic rule. His concerns were never formally recorded. Privately, he warned colleagues that the order seems to be writing its own canon. Within the monastery, internal communications show signs of increasing isolation. A set of recovered letters from a junior monk, preserved by a surviving family member, referenced a troubling phrase, "the silent dormitorium." In context, it seemed to refer to a wing of the monastery where monks were relocated for private discipline. No records of this dormitorium exist in architectural surveys. Construction permits from 1948 suggest underground expansion, but blueprints were filed incompletely. Throughout the early 70s, local clergy began to joke darkly about the Black Hole of Calton's Bridge, a nickname for St. Gabriel that veiled growing discomfort. Some diocesan staff refused to process transfer papers to the monastery, citing past irregularities. But these concerns never reached the public. Only one event briefly pierced the institutional silence. In 1974, a fire broke out in the western orchard, bordering the monastery's farmland. Volunteer firefighters from a neighboring town responded, but were blocked from entering the compound. According to their report, a senior monk claimed the situation was under control and that their equipment was not needed. 2 weeks later, a local botanist conducting soil studies nearby reported that the area showed signs of deliberate scorching. He described charred cloth and remnants of what appeared to be human bone. His findings were dismissed as inconclusive. He was later discredited by his university for unrelated reasons. By the time the 23rd disappearance was noted in late 1975, the pattern was impossible to ignore for those who tracked clerical records. Yet no inquiry was launched. No official statement was issued. The monastery's gates remained closed, and within the valley the silence deepened. The terrain surrounding St. Gabriel Monastery was steep, wooded, and difficult to traverse without intention. Even by the 1970s, the only road in and out was unpaved and susceptible to flooding each spring. Few outsiders entered, and fewer still stayed long. This isolation granted the monastery not only physical distance, but legal ambiguity. Emergency services were located in the neighboring township, technically outside jurisdictional reach unless formally summoned. This created a grey zone, one that over time allowed the monastery's internal affairs to remain largely uninspected. Archival documents show that by 1973, diocesan response to inquiries about missing clergy had settled into a standardized form. Letters from concerned family members were acknowledged with brief replies noting voluntary withdrawal or transfer to contemplative retreat without further elaboration. These explanations, while ambiguous, carried an ecclesiastical authority that deterred further questioning. One mother of a missing priest recounted being told during a diocesan visit, "Your son is in a state of prayer. It is not your place to interrupt it." She left in tears. Her son's belongings were later returned in a single box, sealed and unsigned. Behind closed doors, however, the tone was different. Clergy who had previously served at St. Gabriel and then moved on to other postings spoke of tensions within the order. One former monk, relocated to a parish in Vermont, described the monastery as not cruel, but consuming. He said the rhythm of life inside became so inwardly directed that members ceased to see themselves as part of a wider church. The abbot's word carried a force that rivaled canonical law. Obedience was no longer a virtue. It was a condition of survival. Several attempts to obtain civil oversight were made discreetly, but failed. The local sheriff's office maintained a file titled Monastery Incidents, but its entries were vague and infrequent. One 1971 note mentioned unusual burial activity, referring to an anonymous tip about late-night digging near the South Woods. Deputies sent to investigate reported nothing out of order. The groundskeeper on duty, a lay brother who lived in a separate stone dwelling, explained that a deer had been buried after being struck by a cart. No further questions were asked. This compartmentalization of knowledge, some within the diocese, some among locals, some scattered among quiet whistleblowers, ensured that no single narrative gained traction. The bishop overseeing the region maintained a cautious distance, preferring to reference the monastery as a sovereign community. It was a term with no canonical basis, but one that effectively absolved external offices from regular oversight. Yet signs of internal strain became harder to conceal. Starting in 1974, a series of requests for clerical reassignment began to cite prior residency at OPR 119 as a concern. While such codes were rarely discussed outside official channels, the notation spread informally as a warning. Young priests beginning their service would sometimes receive whispered advice from senior clergy. If they ask you to consider Gabriel, decline. A rare fragment of audio recorded during a conference of regional clergy in early 1975 captured an exchange between two senior priests. One said without irony, "The valley keeps what it's given." The other replied, "And we keep sending it more." The tape, preserved unintentionally as part of a broader session recording, later circulated among a small group of Catholic journalists. Most dismissed it as hearsay. Inside the monastery itself, the culture appeared to grow increasingly insular. Monks were discouraged from referencing past assignments. Individual names were de-emphasized in favor of roles: lector, porter, scribe. This anonymity was praised as humility, but functioned effectively as erasure. When one novice asked about a former brother whose room had remained locked for over a year, he was reportedly told, "He has fulfilled his duty and is now silent." The door remained unopened during his time there. Food production within the monastery became more localized. Livestock deliveries ceased. The orchard, once shared with local parishes during harvest, was gated and guarded. A nearby farmer recounted seeing unfamiliar men clearing brush at dusk in an area he believed had once been communal land. When he approached, they said nothing, only watched until he turned away. The mental strain on remaining clergy grew more visible. Parishioners in the outer counties, where monks from St. Gabriel occasionally led Mass, noted an emotional flatness. Sermons were terse, sometimes repetitive. One elderly woman wrote in her diary after a 1975 service, "His eyes never moved. He spoke as if from memory, not belief." The monk in question vanished from the liturgical schedule weeks later. The architecture of the monastery itself may have contributed to its isolating effect. Designed in the neo-Romanesque style, the structure featured narrow windows, echoing halls and a subterranean library with limited access. The oldest sections, constructed before the turn of the century, included corridors with no public blueprints. During a failed renovation attempt in 1969, contractors reportedly encountered bricked passageways and sealed stairwells. No formal report was filed. The workers were never invited back. Communication with the outside world diminished. The monastery's telephone line was often disconnected, and letters arrived at a P.O. box in town, rather than directly on the premises. One local postal worker recalled that most correspondence arrived in bulk envelopes, handwritten but never addressed to individuals. When asked about the content, she shrugged and said, "Mostly Latin, mostly the same." Amid all this, the tally of disappeared priests continued quietly. Some had entered as young men, left no next of kin, and were mourned by no one. Others had families who continued to write, receiving only form replies in return. A cousin of one missing monk described the ordeal in a 1988 interview. "We thought he'd taken a vow of silence. Now I think they just stopped letting him out." By the end of 1975, the Diocese of Calton had begun a quiet audit of its historical files, hoping perhaps to reconcile discrepancies without public notice. But by then, the paper trail had grown cold. Several older documents had been reclassified, other records were simply missing, and when the office clerk assigned to the review requested access to St. Gabriel's internal registries, she received no reply. What little momentum the inquiry gathered faded with time. Personnel changed, priorities shifted. The monastery, once seen as a relic of devotional purity, was now simply a forgotten fixture on the ecclesiastical map. By the close of the year, it remained outwardly intact. Bells still rang, smoke still rose from the stone chimneys, but within the walls, 23 names no longer echoed. And outside, in the broader silence, no one was held accountable. In early 1976, an archivist named Raymond DeLaury began reviewing clerical appointments for the northeastern region of Pennsylvania. Working under the Diocese of Calton, DeLaury had been assigned to modernize the diocese's paper records into microfilm, a task considered tedious but uncontroversial. He was young, methodical, and largely unaware of the murmurs surrounding St. Gabriel Monastery. His work was limited to names, dates, ordinations, and assignments. It was only when he noticed irregular gaps in the monastery's personnel roster that he began to document the pattern. What first appeared to be administrative oversight soon became a timeline of silent vanishings. Entire years were absent from assignment ledgers. Priests listed as entered Gabriel were not subsequently recorded as leaving. Others had death notations, but no death certificates. When DeLaury flagged this to his supervisor, he was told to treat the monastery's files as final and internal. But the volume of missing follow-ups led him to begin a separate list, kept quietly in the back of his drawer. He gave each missing priest a number rather than a name. By the end of his first month, the list had reached 17. Around this same time, a parish secretary in Elkwood County, one of the rural districts occasionally staffed by monks from St. Gabriel, noticed something strange in the weekly attendance rosters. One priest, listed as celebrant for a sequence of Sunday masses, had not signed the sacristy logs. His name had been entered in advance by the diocesan calendar, but no one recalled seeing him. The following week, a different name was penciled in. That second priest had also disappeared from official correspondence. The secretary mentioned it in passing to her pastor, who waved it off as clerical reshuffling. But she wrote a letter to the diocesan office anyway, asking for clarification. The letter was received but never answered. Months later, she was told during a phone call that the calendar is now centrally managed. She was advised not to make annotations without authorization. Despite the firm discouragement, fragments of awareness were forming. In separate offices and under unrelated pretenses, a handful of staff across the diocese began asking quiet questions. A sacristan in Plath's Hollow wrote to a friend at the Theological College in Philadelphia, remarking that Gabriel's men vanish like snow in spring. The phrase stuck. It was copied onto a note by a visiting professor and eventually mentioned during a closed-door discussion on clergy accountability. The discussion went nowhere, but the phrase was remembered. Meanwhile, Raymond DeLaury's list grew. Each entry corresponded to a year, an arrival, and a lack of departure. He began cross-referencing the names with ordination photographs stored in the diocesan vault. Many were labeled, some were not. In one group photo from 1958, DeLaury identified 3 of the missing. All had entered St. Gabriel within a 5-year window. None had parish assignments beyond it. He began discreetly contacting families. Some responded with confusion, others with bitterness, a few with silence. One mother in Berks County said, "I was told never to speak of it again." Her son had been accepted to St. Gabriel in 1962. She had received only one letter after that, filled with scriptural phrases, but lacking any reference to daily life. The handwriting was stiff, possibly dictated. A brother of another missing priest had taken a different route. In 1970, he had attempted to visit the monastery unannounced. He drove from Harrisburg in the early morning, arriving just before Lord's. At the gate, he was met by a man in monastic garb who refused to give his name. When asked about his sibling, the monk responded, "He is at rest." The visitor interpreted this as death and demanded proof. He was told to leave or face ecclesiastical sanction. He filed a complaint with the diocese. The complaint was closed, citing insufficient evidence. These accounts, collected by Delori over the course of months, painted a portrait that was deeply at odds with the monastery's serene reputation. Yet none of the pieces were definitive. Each was an anecdote, a feeling, a gap. When he finally brought his list to the attention of an auxiliary bishop, the meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. The bishop expressed concern, but emphasized discretion. "Monastic orders are ancient," he said. "Their internal matters are not ours to pass." Outside ecclesiastical circles, awareness remained minimal. The local press rarely covered religious institutions unless related to festivals or retirements. One reporter at the Calton Register began researching monasteries for a lifestyle piece on forgotten vocations, but her editor steered her toward more accessible human interest stories. She eventually shelved the idea, and yet signs of unease began surfacing in unexpected places. A fire inspector, reviewing safety compliance logs for religious institutions, noted that St. Gabriel had not filed an update in over 15 years. When he attempted to schedule a visit, he was informed by the diocesan office that the monastery is exempt due to canonical tradition. The inspector dropped the request but made a private note. Non-compliant, exempt by authority. Review if structure changes ownership. Then came the matter of the bell tower. In late 1976, residents of Calton's Bridge began hearing irregular bell chimes from the monastery. Previously, the bells had rung with strict consistency, morning prayers, midday silence, evening meditation. But now the patterns shifted. Some days the bells did not ring at all. On others, they rang at odd hours, long after sunset. A retired railroad conductor living in the valley's southern bend noted in his journal, "3rd week of October, bells at 2:11 a.m., no mist, no wind, no explanation." Curiosity about the sounds reached a local historical society that had previously archived ecclesiastical architecture in the region. 2 volunteers hiked the perimeter of the monastery property with a field camera, hoping to document the bell tower's silhouette for a community calendar. As they approached the northern tree line, they were stopped by a monk who warned them they were trespassing. One of the volunteers attempted to explain their purpose. The monk replied, "These walls are not meant for calendars." The men left without incident, but described the encounter as deeply unsettling. No official complaint was filed. The pattern of dismissal and avoidance continued into the spring of 1977. A diocesan staff member assigned to property records noticed discrepancies in St. Gabriel's land boundaries. Deeds filed in the 1920s showed a parcel that no longer appeared in modern maps. The parcel was listed as East Dormitory Annex, with a note about temporary quarters for contemplative retreat. When the staffer requested an updated plat map, the reply came in the form of a notarized letter. Annex decommissioned, grounds restored to silence. What this meant in practice was unclear. No demolition permits were found, no boundary adjustments were recorded. And the area in question, when viewed from aerial photographs, appeared overgrown but undisturbed. The staffer made no further inquiry. By now, Raymond Delori's list had reached 21 names. He had begun referring to it internally as the missing fold. At night, he read over the entries, cross-checked their final known locations, and tried to imagine their last days. Some were as young as 28. Others had served nearly 2 decades. All had entered St. Gabriel expecting a life of obedience. None had formally exited. In the margins of his list, Delori began writing questions. Where is the annex? Why were the bells silent on feast days? Who approved the reassignments? Each question led nowhere. Each answer, when offered, was a wall. And then came the 22nd. In May of 1977, a small envelope arrived at the Diocesan Administrative Building, addressed only to Records Office. It bore no return address, but the postmark indicated it had been mailed from within the region. Inside was a faded photograph, a name scrawled on the back, and a single line typed onto a page that had yellowed with age. It read, "This is the 22nd. He never left." The photograph showed a man in clerical attire standing beside what appeared to be the south orchard wall of St. Gabriel Monastery. The timestamp in the corner placed the image in 1972. By diocesan records, the man had been reassigned in 1973 to a parish in New Mexico. But no such parish existed under that name, and correspondence with that diocese revealed no record of his arrival. The archivist who opened the letter, not yet familiar with the full scope of Delorey's list, brought it to the attention of the Internal Legal Counsel. The council reviewed the material, then placed the envelope in a confidential file labeled "Pending Clarification." No formal report was filed. Delorey, upon hearing of the photo weeks later, was not allowed to see it. Meanwhile, within the seminary circles that still had distant ties to the monastery, whispers began to surface among students and faculty. One professor of pastoral ethics recounted a conversation with a former monk who had left St. Gabriel after a year of probationary vows. According to the professor, the monk had spoken vaguely of a basement level not on any schematics, and of long periods during which certain brothers would be called to reflection and not seen again. Though the testimony was anecdotal and second-hand, it added to a growing sense that the walls of the monastery concealed more than tradition. It was not misconduct that people feared. It was absence. Absence with no narrative, no frame, no conclusion. One particularly telling exchange occurred during a clergy retreat held in the Pocono foothills in late 1977. A panel discussion on vocational burnout included a moment when a senior deacon, referencing the monastery indirectly, asked whether prolonged isolation under obedience might become a way to lose men without death. The room fell quiet. The moderator redirected the conversation to scriptural support for resilience. The deacon was not invited to speak again. Outside church institutions, signs of unusual movement in the valley began attracting quiet curiosity. In July, a local boy exploring an old forestry trail encountered a barricaded path with faded signage in Latin. He described hearing voices in the distance, though no one was seen. When his father retraced the path the following day, the barricade was gone. The signage had been removed. They reported nothing, but mentioned it in passing to their neighbor, who happened to be a retired city planner. That planner, Harold Klenn, had once participated in a survey of rural ecclesiastical properties. He decided to revisit old topographical maps of the area and noticed that a footpath once leading toward the eastern slope had been omitted from maps post-1951. Curious, he drove the old route himself and found that the area had been fenced with new timber, reinforced at irregular intervals with iron wiring. He documented his findings in a personal notebook and mailed copies to 2 historical societies. One responded with thanks, the other did not reply. By autumn, Delorey's list had reached 23. The final name came not through official records, but through a personal tip. A former novitiate from a seminary in Delaware wrote to Delorey, identifying a classmate who had entered St. Gabriel in 1974 and been expected back after a seasonal retreat. The novitiate's subsequent letters were returned unopened. He had never found his friend's name in any parish listing again. The only mention he located was in a discontinued religious newsletter, which noted the priest had embraced a stricter calling. No clarification followed. This entry marked the 23rd. Delorey wrote the name in smaller letters. Below it, he underlined the word unverified. Around this time, an unexpected opportunity for independent verification arose. A private academic researcher named Irene Malson, conducting a comparative study of monastic timekeeping practices, sought permission to access bell logs from isolated orders. She included St. Gabriel among her inquiries, unaware of its history. Her formal letter was answered after a 2-month delay, with a reply written in firm, archaic script. "Our clocks belong to the divine. They require no witness." Undeterred, she visited the town of Kelton's Bridge to examine public records for any acoustic disturbances. She was met with shrugs, a few raised eyebrows, and one man who told her flatly, "They don't like being measured." Malson documented a pattern of missing audio between 3 and 5 a.m. on multiple nights recorded by nearby weather stations equipped with barometric sensors. While not proof of anything specific, the anomaly mirrored complaints from residents who claimed that sound near the monastery seemed to retreat into the ground during those hours. She submitted her findings to a regional academic journal. The piece was quietly rejected. Within the diocesan structure, resistance to further inquiry remained absolute. When Delori submitted his findings to an internal auditor, the response was curt. "The records are incomplete. The men were reassigned or released. There is no scandal here." The tone of the memo suggested not dismissal, but containment. Delori was reassigned 3 months later to a historical preservation post in rural Connecticut. He took his list with him. The original copies were destroyed. Only carbon duplicates remained, hidden in his personal archive. And yet, even as institutional doors closed, the outlines of a story remained visible to those who watched carefully. The monastery continued to function. The bells resumed their regular toll, the gate stayed shut. And on feast days, black smoke was sometimes seen rising from the rear chimney, even though no one recalled the monastery ever hosting public liturgies again. In the final weeks of 1977, a priest stationed in the nearby township received an unsigned Christmas card. On the front was a sketch of a cloistered hallway, its lanterns unlit. Inside, a single line read, "Not all retreats end in silence. Some are never meant to end." He placed the card in a drawer and told no one. Years later, when asked why he had kept it, he said, "I think I knew what it meant, but I also knew I was supposed to forget." The first break came not through confession or exposure, but through a clerical accident. In March of 1978, the Diocese of Kelton conducted an audit of inactive properties following a directive from the Regional Episcopal Conference. The purpose was logistical, aiming to update insurance valuations and identify underused assets. Among the sites slated for re-evaluation was a parcel listed only as Annex C, located at the edge of diocesan boundaries. The document attached to the parcel's history referenced St. Gabriel Monastery, but had been mislabeled in transfer. Its deed bore a date from 1936, and no associated updates since. When 2 property clerks arrived on site, guided by maps that did not match the terrain, they found themselves along the eastern slope of the valley, where the road dissolved into underbrush. At the edge of the clearing stood a stone structure, roughly 20 feet wide, recessed into the hill with no visible entrance. It had no signage, no windows, and no obvious path leading to or from it. What caught their attention, however, was the presence of fresh earth along its base, suggesting recent movement or disturbance. They filed a report noting that the parcel appeared to be in use, but offered no means of contact or access. Within a week, the clerks were informed that the site had been reclassified as active monastic use. No follow-up was requested. The clerks were reassigned, and the property was marked as no longer under diocesan purview. Shortly after, word of the finding reached a former seminarian named Paul Edevane, who had briefly studied under a theology professor known to be sympathetic to internal reform. Edevane had once been considered for monastic placement himself, but withdrew after a single visit to St. Gabriel in 1971. He had stayed only 2 nights. In a private letter, he described the experience as like falling into a well but still hearing the bell above you. Years later, while volunteering for a religious archives project, Edevane came across the name of one of the missing priests on a handwritten log referencing the now dormant Annex C. He recognized the name from seminary directories and cross-checked it with the last known location. The match was conclusive. The priest had been listed as reassigned to contemplative duty, a phrase Edevane knew from seminary lectures to be reserved for end-of-life seclusion or disciplinary reflection. But no death record existed. No retreat logs were filed. The man's name did not appear in any parish register after that. Edevane made a copy of the log and brought it to a regional clerical historian. The historian, already familiar with the whispers surrounding St. Gabriel, confirmed that Annex C had once housed what was colloquially referred to as the Quiet Chapter. It was intended as a transitional space for monks no longer fit for full duty but not yet removed from service. Over time, the chapter was spoken of less and less. By the 1960s, even seasoned clergy had only heard of it in rumor. With this confirmation, Edevane began a methodical effort to document the extent of the annex's use. He compiled a list of priests with ambiguous endings to their service records, focusing on those whose last assignment was listed as Gabriel Vicinity or Rural Contemplation. The list resembled Delorey's, though Edevane had no knowledge of that archivist's earlier efforts. Working independently, he identified 14 names with probable connection to the annex. He cross-referenced diocesan memos, ordination yearbooks, and clerical obituaries. For 11 of them, no death record or resignation statement could be located. His inquiry drew quiet attention. One morning, he returned to his shared office to find that 2 of his filing drawers had been emptied and locked with keys that did not match his set. His superior, when asked, claimed no knowledge of the change and advised him to let the matter rest. Edevane requested a transfer the following week and continued his research from home. Outside ecclesiastical circles, the atmosphere around the monastery remained unchanged. Visitors were rare. Local historians occasionally requested interviews or site access, but were routinely denied. One folklorist studying regional religious customs noted that references to St. Gabriel had largely vanished from public parish bulletins after 1975. She contacted the diocesan office for clarification and was told the monastery had entered a phase of inward devotion. The phrase was unfamiliar to her. No definition was offered. It was during this time that a short article appeared in a regional Catholic periodical discussing the erasure of silent vocations. The piece, attributed to P.E., did not mention any institutions by name, but described a growing trend of records being quietly redirected, misfiled, or delayed indefinitely, especially for clergy assigned to non-parish duties. The author suggested that the bureaucracy of silence had replaced discipline with disappearance. The article was printed once and never reprinted. A copy was clipped and mailed anonymously to an address in Calton's Bridge. No one claimed receipt. Around the same period, a former maintenance worker who had once serviced the monastery's outer fencing came forward to a diocesan retiree gathering with a troubling anecdote. He described being asked in 1972 to help construct a set of ventilation grates along a slope near the orchard. The grates were not connected to any visible structure, and when he asked what they were for, the monk supervising him replied, "We prepare our rooms for silence." The worker remembered the phrasing because it was delivered without expression. He was paid in cash and never brought back. His account, though unverifiable, aligned with the known topography of the area surrounding Annex C. The placement of the grates suggested an underground structure, larger than the surface facade implied. The soil disruption noted by the property clerks now took on new significance. Finally, in late 1978, the matter reached a fragile moment of potential exposure. A low-level investigator from the Archdiocesan Compliance Committee auditing retirement benefits flagged several inactive pensions that continued to receive disbursements despite their recipients being unlocatable. All 5 had last assignments listed as St. Gabriel. Attempts to confirm their status through monastic records were unsuccessful. When the investigator contacted the monastery directly, she was told, "All members are accounted for in prayer." No further information was provided. The incident was brought to the attention of the Financial Oversight Board. A decision was made to discontinue payments pending proof of life. The following month, 3 of the accounts were closed by unidentified proxies. The remaining 2 were reclassified under a new category labeled non-responsive contemplative. The classification carried no precedent and no oversight. Edevane, upon learning of this through an anonymous source in the finance office, began compiling his findings into a private dossier. He titled the file The Cloistered Void. It contained copies of property deeds, missing records, unverified pensions, and letters from relatives. The file was never published. Edevane died in 1996. His papers remained sealed until 2013, when a regional historical society acquired his archive. Most of the documents were intact. What the dossier revealed was a mosaic of erasure, each piece carefully shaped to appear as ordinary loss or spiritual transition. But together, they formed a structure too deliberate to be accidental. The monastery had created a system not only for inward living, but for controlled vanishing. It required no force, no scandal, only the absence of inquiry, and the quiet willingness of institutions to look away. In the early months of 1979, a former diocesan administrative assistant named Teresa Wendell quietly began compiling notes from her 8 years of internal clerical correspondence. Having retired the previous year due to illness, she spent much of her time organizing old files she had taken home during her final weeks on staff. Among the piles were carbon copies of appointment letters, memos from the Chancery, and handwritten annotations that she had jotted during meetings. She had never intended to investigate anything, but one pattern would not leave her alone. She had handled incoming mail for the Office of Ordinations and noticed that between 1960 and 1975, an unusual number of new priests assigned to contemplative service ended their clerical trail with a letter from the monastery. Each letter bore the same phrase in Latin, "Secessit in silentium." It was not common. Even in monastic terms, it was archaic. The phrase roughly translated to, "He has withdrawn into silence," but was not part of standard ecclesiastical lexicon. Wendell initially assumed it was a poetic flourish, perhaps a traditional phrasing unique to that order, but over time she noticed it was used exclusively for those assigned to Saint Gabriel, and never once in correspondence from any other contemplative institution in the region. No follow-up letters, no death notices, no transfers. The phrase marked an end without conclusion. When she mentioned this in passing to a former colleague, the reaction was immediate discomfort. The colleague lowered her voice and said, "We were told not to translate it aloud." Wendell asked who had given that instruction, but the colleague declined to elaborate. Later that spring, Wendell visited the diocesan archive under the pretense of researching retirement records. She located 3 of the original letters bearing the phrase. Each was stamped with the seal of St. Gabriel Monastery, but lacked a countersignature from the diocesan vicar general. In standard protocol, all clerical transitions required both. That absence, she realized, rendered the status of those men unofficial. This discovery unsettled her. It implied that the monastery had, at some point, bypassed oversight to create its own form of closure. It also suggested that those who received the letters may not have recognized the discrepancy or had chosen to ignore it. Wendell made handwritten transcriptions of each letter and returned the originals. She did not copy them directly, fearing disciplinary action should anyone discover her doing so. Instead, she began a private chronology in a bound notebook, cross-referencing each name with entries in diocesan directories and monastic newsletters. The absences aligned perfectly with the known window of disappearances. She wrote no conclusions, only dates. Around the same time, a librarian at the regional seminary requested archival materials from monastic institutions for a study on liturgical practices. St. Gabriel responded with a set of printed psalters and one thin volume titled Regula Interna, or Internal Rule. The book contained guidelines for daily prayer, fasting schedules, and protocols for extended contemplation. But tucked inside the binding on unnumbered pages was a passage written in Latin that had not appeared in earlier editions held at the diocesan library. It referred to the corridor of withdrawal, described only in oblique terms. According to the text, certain members called to silence were to be kept in communion by separation. Their days would be structured around hourly intervals of static prayer and observation, unbroken by external ritual. The passage ended with a line that read, "Their devotion is not for our witness, it is offered into the absence." The librarian, fluent in Latin, made a translation and shared it with 2 colleagues. One of them, a moral theology lecturer, described it as theological concealment. The other advised against citing the passage publicly. The book was returned without annotation. Back in Calton's Bridge, Small disruptions continued to ripple outward from the monastery's edge. A utility technician tasked with inspecting a water pressure drop near the outer line reported that the reading station inside the monastery had been sealed. He was redirected by a monk who insisted the monastery had returned to manual storage. No such process existed for water pressure regulation. The technician filed an irregular report, which was later dismissed as non-critical. Simultaneously, a curious development unfolded in the town's library. An intern digitizing obituaries noticed that certain clergy listed in mid-century issues of the diocesan newsletter had no death records at all, despite being referenced in past tense. The language used was cautious. "Remember Brother Elias in your prayers as he continues in rest." The phrasing did not confirm death. The intern cross-checked the names with the town's burial index and found no entries. She mentioned it during a staff meeting and was told the monastery managed its own commemorations. The ambiguity deepened when, during a rare evening event at the Regional Theological College, a guest lecturer referenced perpetual submission structures in monastic communities. He spoke briefly of cases where obedience extended beyond ecclesial norms and entered a space he termed structural occlusion. When asked to elaborate, he declined, stating only that such arrangements were entirely self-regulating. That phrase caught the attention of an attending historian, who later traced its usage to a 1943 encyclical draft, never published, that warned against the potential for spiritual isolation to become administrative extinction. The draft had been shelved after opposition from two influential monastic orders. One of them had ties to the founders of St. Gabriel. By late 1979, these scattered findings had begun to accumulate in private collections and whispered conversations. No institution acknowledged them. No formal inquiry was launched. But the individuals involved, archivists, former staff, retired clergy, began to understand they were not alone in their observations. There was a pattern, not visible to the public, not criminal in any prosecutable sense, but present, recurrent, and protected. One of the few external efforts to break this silence came from a former seminarian who had once considered taking vows at St. Gabriel. He mailed letters to every diocese in the state, requesting information about priests who had entered contemplative withdrawal without public reassignment. Most replied with general statements about privacy and prayer. One response, however, came in a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sentence: "Their doors are stone, and stone does not answer." He kept the note in his personal Bible. Years later, when asked about it in an interview, he said, "I didn't know what to do with that answer, but I never forgot it." The silence around the monastery persisted. No press coverage, no public dissent. The valley remained quiet. The bells resumed their rhythm. And each season, the monastery's garden bloomed and fell back into itself without interruption. What emerged was not a revelation, but a texture, the sense that within the walls of St. Gabriel a system had been perfected, not to destroy, but to unremember. It did not erase, it omitted. And those who entered were not lost, but slowly removed from record, from ritual, from recognition. There, by 1981, St. Gabriel Monastery no longer appeared on diocesan distribution lists. It was not marked as closed, nor designated as active. It had, in administrative terms, become neutral. The regional office no longer received requests from the monastery, nor sent clergy for service or sabbatical. Its name was struck from internal travel rosters, and its quarterly financial disclosures ceased without remark. Yet the monastery remained physically intact. Smoke continued to rise from the eastern chimney. Visitors occasionally reported seeing men in black habits tending to the orchard's edge. The structure, like its function, persisted outside notation. In nearby Calton's Bridge, residents had stopped referring to the monastery directly. When asked, they would say only, "It's there," with a vague gesture toward the trees. Local maps shrank the property footprint to a pale grey outline, marked only by elevation. Tourism brochures made no mention of it. One family, newly arrived in 1982, asked about visiting the grounds and were advised by 3 separate neighbors not to approach. "They don't receive," said one. "They don't explain," said another. "They just are," said the third. Inside the diocesan archive, the remaining materials related to the monastery were consolidated into a box labeled OPR 1119, Inactive Review. Its contents were sparse: a few postcards from early decades, a faded copy of the monastic rule, and several carbon forms of non-specific transfer statements. A typed index on yellowed paper listed 23 names without dates or destinations. The final page bore a rubber-stamped note: "No further review scheduled." The archivist assigned to maintain the collection, a quiet man in his 60s named Leo Krantz, kept the box on a lower shelf behind the general correspondence. He referred to it as the silent drawer. Krantz rarely spoke about the monastery, but once remarked to a junior colleague that some files are meant to hold still. He never elaborated. As years passed, awareness of St. Gabriel faded from active conversation. Priests who had once served near its boundary retired or died. New clergy were assigned without mention of the valley. Seminary instructors no longer cited it as a model of contemplative life. Its name became something whispered only among those who had known someone who had once entered, or who had almost gone themselves. And yet, not everyone forgot. In 1985, a doctoral candidate in ecclesiastical history at a private Midwestern university began a thesis on patterns of clerical withdrawal in post-conciliar America. Her research led her through records of inactive assignments, lapsed vocational paths, and small rural monastic closures. In the midst of this work, she encountered a reference to Gabriel's void in a footnote of an unpublished paper written by a seminary professor in 1978. The phrase was unexplained but underlined. She traced the phrase to an interlibrary index and discovered a series of diocesan yearbooks from the 1950s through the 1970s with inconsistent entries for St. Gabriel. The number of resident clergy would fluctuate drastically from one year to the next, with no corresponding records of departures. When she requested access to personnel logs through the diocese, she received a standard reply: "All monastic appointments remain under internal regulation." She contacted other dioceses for comparison. Most either denied knowledge of the monastery or referred to it as no longer communicative. The deeper she pursued the topic, the more distant the monastery became. Those who might have known something were gone or unwilling. Those who remained spoke only in abstractions. "They served in quiet," said one former bishop. "They were an exception," said another. When asked if any investigation had ever been made, the reply was consistent: there was nothing to investigate. The thesis, when completed, made only passing reference to the monastery. The candidate had been advised to focus on broader patterns and avoid unverifiable claims. Still, in her private research notes, she left a short paragraph labeled St. Gabriel Anomaly. Beneath it, 3 lines: 23 names, no exit forms, no graves. Elsewhere, a small group of independent researchers, many former clerics or lay archivists, formed an informal network dedicated to tracing unresolved vocational gaps. They called themselves the Continuum and operated out of personal study rooms and borrowed church libraries. One of their early investigations revisited Delory's list, which had surfaced in an academic archive following his death. They found it remarkably detailed but incomplete. Using new tools, property databases, retirement indexes, pension trace software, they began assembling a broader map of the monastery's historical footprint. They located shipment logs for supplies, outdated utility records, and delivery invoices for materials that did not match the monastery's stated function. Invoices for iron reinforcement, air filtration units, high-density archival paper with no known output. None of these orders appeared in diocesan financial summaries. One researcher obtained copies of zoning documents filed in 1946 for structural reinforcement to non-public retreat quarters. The plans referenced subterranean space totaling over 2,000 square feet. The project was listed as completed. No subsequent inspection records were found. As the Continuum's records grew, so did their concern. Their findings lacked narrative. There was no whistleblower, no breach, no voice from within. Only the shapes left behind, the outlines of names not finished, the structures without maps. The phrases repeated too precisely: withdrawn in silence, assigned beyond registry, fulfilled internal vocation. In 1988, an opportunity emerged when a diocesan publishing initiative requested testimonies from retired clergy. One former monk from a neighboring order submitted a short reflection. In it, he wrote of a brother house that had sought devotion through absence and had, in his view, confused obedience with elimination. The essay was excluded from the final collection. He was not contacted further. The monastery remained. Its silence was never interrupted. No event drew public scrutiny. No change of leadership was announced. Its presence endured by not shifting. The orchard still bore fruit, harvested without fanfare. The bells rang in patterns known only to those inside, and each winter the valley filled with snow that no footsteps crossed. But silence in time accumulates weight. By the turn of the decade, those who remembered began to do so not with fear, but with a restless need to speak. A seminarian who had once delivered produce to the monastery sent an unsigned letter to a regional journal. It ended with the line, "We all knew they didn't come back, we just stopped asking why." In 1990, a former diocesan clerk walking through a regional cemetery for a funeral paused at a section marked for religious orders. He counted 36 headstones. Of them, 23 bore names he did not recognize. The dates of death were all marked within an 18-year span. Each bore the same epitaph, "In silence, fulfillment." The cemetery section remained unchanged for years. The stones were kept clean, the grass evenly trimmed. No flowers were left. No visitors were recorded signing the registry maintained at the chapel entrance. The location was technically under the jurisdiction of a regional clerical retirement home, yet no record tied the 23 names to any known community. When questioned, staff said the plots had been designated for silent vows, a term with no canonical definition. One groundskeeper, when asked who buried the men, replied without hesitation, "They bury their own." By the early 1990s, the monastery's name had disappeared from internal Catholic directories, not closed, not decommissioned, simply omitted. Seminaries no longer referenced it in their contemplative track programs. New clerics were unaware of its location or history. Those who passed near the valley, delivery drivers, field researchers, hikers, spoke only of a narrow road with no shoulder and an iron gate that never opened. A few continued to remember. The continuum, though diminished in size, maintained its archive from a modest shared office on the second floor of a library annex. Their documents were sorted in plain manila folders with hand-lettered labels. Each name they had traced was assigned a file. Each file contained not answers, but fragments, photocopied registry entries, altered pension slips, unsigned letters, returned to sender envelopes. In 1993, a visiting scholar from Milan requested access to the archive while researching patterns of monastic removal in pre-reform institutions. He reviewed 3 folders, requested no copies, and left with a single note. They did not disappear. They were relocated from memory. That same year, the diocese quietly repurposed an administrative clause for the formal removal of clerical placeholders. The clause allowed the internal removal of clergy who had entered monastic reclusion with no formal end to their service. Under the clause, status updates were no longer required, and financial tracking ceased. It was labeled an efficiency measure. One member of the continuum, a former diocesan financial officer named Helen Caro, noted the clause's passage with dismay. She drafted a memorandum citing its potential for abuse, listing St. Gabriel's 23 as a precedent. Her memo received no reply. The clause remained in effect unchallenged. Caro eventually left the continuum and moved out of state. Before leaving, she passed her files to a younger researcher, who stored them in sealed envelopes in his home study. He later wrote, "We always hoped for a break in the pattern. Instead, the pattern broke us, not with violence, but with the weight of its steadiness." Back in Calton's Bridge, the monastery itself showed no signs of decay. Its walls remained free of ivy. Its slate roof never chipped. Locals speculated that maintenance was handled internally. No trucks were seen, no contractors were hired. It was as though the building sustained itself, as quietly as its inhabitants. In 1995, a minor earthquake registered in the region, shallow and brief. Geological surveys afterward revealed that an underground cavity near the eastern slope had partially collapsed. The survey team, unaware of the monastery's presence, mapped the area and filed a public report. 2 months later, the report was quietly retracted due to data inconsistency. The revised map showed no cavity, no instability, only bedrock. A retired civil engineer reviewing old topographical surveys for unrelated research noticed the omission. He made an inquiry to the Land Office, requesting copies of the original scans. He was told they had been archived but not retained. When he mentioned the earlier version by name, the line went silent for a moment. Then the clerk said, "There's no reference under that identifier." Elsewhere, the idea of St. Gabriel began to take on a different shape. In certain corners of theological discourse, the monastery became a symbol, not of sanctity or mystery, but of unresolved obedience. Authors referenced it obliquely as an example of disappeared structure. A phrase emerged in academic papers, the architecture of retreat, used to describe institutions that continued to function without evident purpose or accountability. It was not always clear whether the authors believed the monastery still existed, but the monastery did exist. The bells still rang, though no schedule was ever confirmed. The orchard still yielded, though no fruit was sold or shared. Each year on the first Sunday of Advent, a column of smoke was seen rising just before sunrise from the western flue. Always a single column, always briefly. In 1998, a journalist working on a book about abandoned religious spaces contacted the diocesan office to request a site visit. He was told the monastery did not offer tours. When he asked whether it was inhabited, the response was, "Its function is internal." No explanation followed. He later attempted to approach the grounds on foot, entering through a narrow trail used by hunters. After 30 minutes, he reached the outer wall and paused. He described hearing faint choral tones not distinct enough to make out words. As he stood listening, a figure in dark robes appeared at the far edge of the field. The figure did not approach, did not wave, only stood. The journalist turned back. He did not write about the experience. Over the following years, regional planning commissions submitted proposals for road improvements near the valley. Each time, the route was adjusted to avoid the monastery's land. Planners cited environmental preservation and historical zoning, though no such designations had ever been officially filed. When pressed for details, they deferred to legacy constraints. By the year 2000, nearly all institutional memory of the monastery had faded. It was not spoken of in clergy meetings. It appeared in no promotional materials. Its name did not arise in conflict or celebration. It had achieved a rare form of permanence, unspoken endurance. What had begun as a community of prayer had become something else. Not a place of secrecy, but of uninspected continuity. The final known reference came from a priest in retirement who, during an interview for a diocesan oral history project, was asked about monastic influences in the region. He paused, then said, "There was one that went quiet so long we started thinking of it as a breath held forever." He gave no name. The interviewer moved on. St. Gabriel Monastery remained. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering.